You walk through the wastelands during the darkness of night, approaching what looks to be the ruins of a former city before the bombs ever dropped. As you begin to walk through the city, you hear what sounds like people arguing. You carefully but quickly follow the sounds of their voices and find a strange sight. There's giant ants, robots, and two people wearing superhero costumes.
You and your pathetic tin cans are no match for my army.
The citizens of this town have nothing to fear. The Mechanist is here to protect them.
Hello and welcome to Anatomy of Fiction. In today's video, we are going to be discussing the superhero and supervillain of Fallout 3. More specifically, which of them is the real villain. To do this, we are going to be going over three things. Who is the Mechanist? Who is the AntAgonizer? And what are they both doing in Canterbury Commons? To begin, we should start with who is the Mechanist. The Mechanist is one of the members of Canterbury Commons. However, he was not always the Mechanist, nor was he always a citizen of this little town. His story actually starts in the farms out in the wastelands. He was the child of bean farmers, who raised him up until he was 15 years old, giving him the name Scott Walensky. However, Scott would not have just a peaceful life on the farm. No, turning 15 would actually be where his real journey would begin. Scott would be sold by his parents to a traveling caravan merchant. Here he would work as an indentured servant, often being called by the nickname Bean, as that is literally what his parents traded him for. After a while of working for these caravan merchants, he would eventually buy his freedom, leading to him eventually settling down in Canterbury Commons, which is where you, the lone wanderer, meet him. This is where he has lived past several years, mostly in solitude, making the former robot repair store his home. His main form of work in the town was as a mechanic, repairing various things for the other members of the town. But what actually triggered him to become the Mechanist? Well, his fight against the AntAgonizer was not always as the Mechanist. Originally, he had created and maintained his own robot. This was mainly in an attempt to protect the town from her and her army of ants. However, after one particularly rough fight, this robot was destroyed. This would lead to his discussion with the little boy Derek, another member of Canterbury Commons, who happens to be slightly obsessed with superheroes and supervillains. With this conversation, Derek would suggest to Scott that he should fight back against her like a real superhero. With this, Scott would become the Mechanist, a superhero himself, creating his Mechanist suit and taking on the persona of the Mechanist. As the Mechanist, he worked on creating a robot army he would hope to lead to protect the town of Canterbury Commons. This is where he would stop responding to his own name, only responding to those who called him the Mechanist, spending most of his time in the back of the robot repair shop, in a lair he calls the Forge. Let's checkpoint this. Is the Mechanist the villain in this scenario? Well, the Mechanist became the Mechanist in this situation for two reasons. For revenge, but also to protect the town he had made his home. The Mechanist desired to protect his home from the ant attacks, which he had initially done through the robots he had built. These managed to mostly kill and drive away the ants. However, this was until his favorite robot was destroyed by one of these ant attacks. This is what pushed him over the edge and drove him to desire revenge. Being of course encouraged by Derek, who wanted superheroes at his doorstep, and his town to become a little more interesting. With the desire to protect his town, this does not make him evil. However, with his actions putting the town in more danger and causing more damage to the town as a Mechanist, this being due to the robots and ants fighting, leading to more broken buildings, considering his act of revenge, rather than protecting the other people of Canterbury Commons, putting them in more danger. This does make him more problematic. He could have drawn the ants away, he could have gotten rid of the nest, and he could have gotten rid of the AntAgonizer. Instead, he continued these fights inside of the small town, risking the surrounding businesses, homes, and lives of those in Canterbury Commons. So for this, it does make him just as bad as the AntAgonizer. Uncle Ro even claims that the robots are more dangerous than the ants ever were.
Now he doesn't even respond to his name, and his robot army is more dangerous to the town than the ants ever were.
So for this, it makes the Mechanist a villain, considering he had caused more harm and damage to the town than the AntAgonizer ever had. So the Mechanist may be the villain of his own story. But we haven't even discussed the AntAgonizer. So to learn if she is truly as problematic as she seems, we should go into her villain origin story. So who is the AntAgonizer and where did she come from? Well, the queen of all ants was not always an ant-obsessed lady. Instead, she began life as Tanya Kristoff, the daughter of caravan merchants. But as per usual, this is no story with a happily ever after. No, that would be too easy, and this is Fallout after all. Instead of her growing up and learning the ropes, taking over the family business, her entire family would be killed in an attack by giant ants. Now, what is that saying? If you don't get eaten, join them? Or something along those lines? Anyway, moving on. Little Tanya's body would never be found, so up until the AntAgonizer arrived, no one knew what happened to the poor child. However, there would still be more to the story in the triggering of her antics. No, this would actually come from her grief and her attempt to rationalize the ant's behavior. To do this, she would turn to hubris comics, more specifically Grognak the Barbarian. But this would not be to side with the hero of the story. Instead, she would become fascinated and attached to the villain of the story, the AntAgonizer. But why? Well, it turns out they were actually pretty similar. Both the comic AntAgonizer and the AntAgonizer that would go on to harass Canterbury Commons were orphaned as young girls. They would also both befriend and live among ants, as well as eventually develop a deep hatred for other humans. Tanya, the AntAgonizer attacking Canterbury Commons, would end up with several interesting ideas about the ants, her former family, and of course Canterbury Commons. Tanya would go on to believe that the ants had killed the filth that was her family as a way of rescuing her from them. After the deaths of her family, she was left disgusted and haunted by them, to the point of her no longer desiring to identify as a human, leading her to become the AntAgonizer. She believes that the comic explains the reason behind her life's direction, and that she must follow the same path as the AntAgonizer. This being that she must take over the land and make it into one giant ant colony. This is essentially where Canterbury Commons comes in. The AntAgonizer, before becoming the AntAgonizer, did actually have some relation to the town of Canterbury Commons. But what would that be? Well, her parents, the human ones, not the ant ones, as part of their caravan business, were who she blamed for making Canterbury Commons the trading hub it is today. This being due to it being along their merchant route. This made Canterbury Commons, in her opinion, a blight among the Capital Wastelands, something that had to be removed. Which is why she, after several years of being presumed dead, with several months of sightings of a woman hanging in and around the sewers, with ant nests popping up wherever she was spotted, she would emerge as the AntAgonizer, with her ant friends and attack the town. These attacks, in the beginning, initially proved to be harmless, and actually rather entertaining, with one member of the town essentially thwarting an attack by shooting at the ants. However, she would eventually kill off the robot that protects the town. So let's checkpoint this. Is the AntAgonizer the villain of this scenario? Well, to figure this out, we should first discuss her origin, because without several key steps in her origin story, she would just be Tanya, the girl who got orphaned by ants. The first key step in this, obviously, being the fact that she got orphaned by ants. The ant attack being so bad that she had no living family to take her in and prevent her from becoming a sort of supervillain. But if that was all there was, she could have still found people willing to take her in, or maybe work for a caravan merchant that knew her family. But instead, she isolated herself, living with the ants. Her next step that would start her on the slippery slope would be the obsession of the character of the AntAgonizer. Now, reading comics is not an issue. However, the ideas that sprang forth from her reading the comics, now that was the issue. Her believing that she was the AntAgonizer, that she must follow the character's story, this is where more issues arise and she begins to become a villain. However, it is not until she actually attacks people that she becomes a villain. As with all of these actions, up until she attacks Canterbury Commons, she had the ability to change her ways. However, with the first attack and the repeated attacks on the town, this makes the AntAgonizer a villain. It is not her unfortunate upbringing, it is, however, what she chose to make of it. She could have made several positive changes. like becoming someone who researched the ants or domesticated them so they were not a problem for citizens of the Capital Wastelands. Instead, she would use them to turn on people. The trained ants could have been helpful in everyday life, but instead they were being used to disrupt and harm her fellow people. So for that, it makes her the villain of her own story. But what is she and the Mechanist doing in Canterbury Commons, considering that their constant fighting is centered around this town? Why not move on to elsewhere? So what are the Mechanist and the AntAgonizer even doing in Canterbury Commons? It would make sense if this was their first battle of sorts that they had been in the same small town. However, according to Uncle Ro, this is likely the 20th time he has seen their fights. So they have been around for quite a while, considering they have fought that many times. But why did Canterbury Commons not get rid of them originally? Well, the AntAgonizer's antics did originally have some benefits for the town. The frequent attacks from her and her army of ants actually scared away raiders and slavers, this preventing any other negative attacks on the town, as these groups prefer easy targets. Having a woman randomly show up with aggressive ants that will attack anyone makes the town a little bit more difficult to attack. However, with time, these would not be the only other groups scared away. The town's popularity as a trading hub would diminish, this being due to the caravan merchants also being scared away, as they preferred not to lose their inventory or lives to these ants, especially considering that these attacks were unpredictable. This scaring away of business would also be detrimental to the town, with the townsfolk forming their own opinions of her. Some, like Dominic, seeing her as more of a sideshow attraction than a real danger to the town. Machete sees her as an annoyance, that the only real reason she hasn't gotten rid of is because of that kid Derek. Derek sees her as several things, both a hero of his, as well as someone who is capable of hurting others. She is strong and forceful. With this, he admires her and wishes that either she or the Mechanist would take him on as a sidekick. He sees her as entertainment and someone to look up to, rather than the danger that the Mechanist views her as. Although her attacks had ramped up more and more before the Mechanist became the Mechanist, she was not viewed by the majority of the people in the town as a real danger to the town. So we know why Canterbury Commons has allowed the AntAgonizer to stay, but why the Mechanist? Well, this is for several reasons. The Mechanist was originally the mechanic of the town, so many of the members of the town are fond of him, some more than others. He was described as plenty fierce with a wrench and some solder by Uncle Ro, and even Dom had kind words to say about him, claiming he was a damned good friend. All of this obviously being before his debut as the Mechanist and his obsession with his new persona. This is where we obviously have Machete having a negative opinion of both him and the AntAgonizer, claiming that if it wasn't for other members of the town like Dom, she would have killed them both already. Considering that Dominic had a close friendship with the Mechanist back when he was Scott, Derek views the Mechanist as smart and good, claiming he has no weaknesses, except that he would never intentionally hurt someone he viewed as innocent, even though his fights with the AntAgonizer were doing this anyway to the people of Canterbury Commons, driving away their business and hurting their ability to source supplies that they could not make themselves. So this makes them both problematic in a sense. Let's checkpoint this. What are they doing in Canterbury Commons? And who exactly is the villain here? Well, both the Mechanist and the AntAgonizer have previous connections to Canterbury Commons before putting on their supersuits and fighting like cats and dogs. Considering that the AntAgonizer, her relationship with Canterbury Commons comes from her family, who she speaks of with fear and disgust, among other humans, it is also understandable that she is both attached to Canterbury Commons, however, is also traumatized by it. This is why she initially seeks out Canterbury Commons to wipe clean her family's influence. Her being allowed to continue her attacks was initially due to the entertainment value of it, but also due to the fact it scared away other potential dangers to their businesses, like raiders and slavers. However, with her attacks becoming more and more intense and aggressive, the acceptance of her behaviour would decrease, as this would also begin to impact the livelihoods of those in Canterbury Commons. So initially she was allowed to be the villain she desired to be by the townfolks, as it actually helped them. As she became more dangerous, they accepted this less and desired it less. This leading to the eventual meddling of the Mechanist, rather than her backing down and retreating once there was competition for the position of person wearing a strange supersuit whilst doing stuff around town. It seems as if they both, after the initial confrontation, craved more. as if desiring to act out a comic book and have their own arch nemesis. With the Mechanist, his reasoning of being in Canterbury Commons is just that it is where he wound up after leaving the caravans. It is where he found work and friendship. However, he still felt as though he was the outsider and low not in this town, with the destroyed robot being his favourite robot, obviously being enough to trigger him. With the Mechanist and the Antagonizer fighting each other, it is almost as if they had found someone who understood them. They both had difficult pasts. Both chose different paths forward. So for this, although the Mechanist repeatedly put the town of Canterbury Commons in danger with his robots, and did cause damage, he is not the villain in this segment. He was trying to protect Canterbury Commons, whereas the Antagonizer was actively trying to destroy it. So let's break down the score and see who is the real supervillain, beginning with the Mechanist and his past. So the Mechanist's true identity is the 40-year-old man known as Scott Walensky, who inhabits the town of Canterbury Commons. His identity is no secret, and neither is his past, being raised by his father on a farm for the first 15 years, ending up being sold to travelling caravan merchants, then eventually working off his debt to end up in the town of Canterbury Commons, essentially being there as the fix-it guy. Initially, this would make him the good guy. After all, he was maintaining Dominic's weapons, keeping a security robot active that protected the city, and just fixing anything anyone needed, until that robot got destroyed. His desire for revenge against the Antagonizer is where his problems lie. With this, rather than caring more about protecting the citizens of Canterbury Commons, he wanted to get revenge on the Antagonizer for her destruction. If his desire for protecting the town outweighed his desire for revenge, he could have scared her off and made her flee. Rather, he has the small battles where no side wins, 20 or so times. This is not in an attempt to encourage the town's safety. It actually causes more harm than good to the town, scaring off business and damaging the buildings. So for his willingness to keep the Antagonizer around rather than scaring her off as his nemesis, as part of a revenge plot, and not actually protecting the town from harm or damage, he is the villain of his own story. Moving on to the Antagonizer. Her beginnings are quite tragic. However, like Scott, the man behind the Mechanist, Tanya also could have made a less evil life for herself. Considering her family were killed by ants, she had a pretty unfortunate start to life. But hey, things can only go up from here, unless you grab a shovel and keep digging, because that is what she did, becoming obsessed and attached to a fictional character who happened to have some similarities as well as being a major villain in the story, deciding that this was the plot of her life. If I was to decide that my favourite book and its main character was the plot of my life, well, one, I would probably be taller, but I also would be very dead. So I guess you win some, you lose some. Having some of the skills and features of your favourite characters may be great. However, basing your whole alter ego personality on them and becoming an evil comic book villain could be considered to be a bit much. However, identifying as the comic book villain would not make her a villain. No, it would instead be her attacking the town of Canterbury Commons repeatedly. Although entertaining, she did mean harm. So this makes the Antagonizer the villain of her own story. Moving on to both the Mechanist and the Antagonizer being in Canterbury Commons. Why are they still here? Well, the reasoning behind Antagonizer not being shooed away or gotten rid of immediately by the several armed members of the town is it kept other trouble at bay and was free entertainment with her long speeches and strange behaviour. However, it did become more and more troublesome with the more aggressive attacks, obviously leading to the Mechanist becoming the Mechanist. With the Antagonizer, her attacks rarely caused any damage to actually come to the town. However, with the Mechanist and his introduction of the robot army he had to crush her, the same cannot be said. Considering that the robot army was much stronger than the Antagonizer, he should have easily crushed her and scared her off to a less guarded town. Instead, they have fought about 20 times, causing much damage to the town and leading to the merchants who previously traded with the Canterbury Commons to avoid the area, due to the trouble it brings. With this, it makes it seem as if his initial desire for revenge came more of a desire for a comic book story, like the character she is attempting to play out, with each other being the other's arch nemesis, which is potentially why they do not manage to defeat each other. This is something they enjoy. They have found someone who somewhat understands them, even though they are enemies, both of them being outsiders, having difficult upbringings. However, with this, it still leads to those in Canterbury Commons being put at risk, and with the Antagonizer purposefully attacking the town, this makes her the villain. Considering that both her decision from her backstory to pursue this path and her decisions to repeatedly attempt to harm innocent people, this makes her the real villain of Canterbury Commons. Even though the majority of damage is done by the Mechanist, he did it out of the desire to protect the people there, rather than endanger them. The same cannot be said for her. Let me know in the comments who you think the real villain of Canterbury Commons is. If you enjoyed this video, then you will enjoy this video. It is about who you should give the cure to in the Fallout 3 DLC, The Pit, and the group's motivations.